At supper, my mother gestured toward me and remarked, "Sure, he covers the expenses, but he'll forever remain the foolish one lacking a diploma." My sibling chuckled. My father simply drank his wine. I'd purchased that home for them, settled their loans, provided them with all they needed. That evening, I turned on my computer and began disconnecting every support, step by step. I 32M, gazed at my mom's self-satisfied expression from across the supper table, her statement still ringing in my mind. She had just aimed her finger at me as if I were a letdown on display and declared to all there that although I might handle the costs, I'd always be the unintelligent one without a diploma. My sibling emitted that well-known chuckle of approval, the identical noise she'd produced since childhood whenever Mom criticized me. Dad merely continued drinking his wine, the pricey bottle I'd selected from my stock, pretending he hadn't caught a word. The contradiction didn't escape me. I was seated in the eating area of the residence I'd acquired for them 3 years prior after Dad's building company failed, and they were at risk of losing their previous home. The loan installments, the land fees, the coverage, all deducted from my funds each month. The vehicle financing for both their cars, the loan balances I'd erased when Mom's buying habit almost ruined them. Even the wine Dad was so deliberately ignoring eye contact over, all of it linked back to my allegedly lesser, credential-free finances. I left university at 19 to launch my yard care enterprise. At the time, they'd labeled it wasting my future. Mom would present me to her acquaintances as her child who was attempting to discover his path, while Dad would simply sigh whenever anyone inquired about my career goals. They never noticed the dawn starts, the exhausting labor, the gradual growth from one customer to a team of 12 workers handling deals in 3 areas. All they perceived was their letdown embodied. The yard care operation had grown into asset oversight, then property funding, then a modest network of leased units and business agreements. By 30, I was earning more yearly than both their former incomes added together. But in their view, I stayed the household flop because I lacked a framed certificate on my wall. My sibling was employed as a promotions specialist at a new company, just getting by on her pay despite her valued undergraduate credential. She resided in a tiny flat and operated a vehicle that was mostly corrosion rather than steel. But she had finished with top honors, so she remained the favored offspring. Mom would boast about her daughter, the university alum, while I sat there, having just completed detailing why their land fees had risen and how I'd managed the hike. The discussion at supper had begun harmlessly. Mom was informing Dad about encountering their former neighbor at the market, and how the lady had been boasting about her son, advancing to associate at a legal practice. That's when Mom had stared right at me and issued her declaration about credentials and smarts, as if my monetary inputs were merely fortunate mishaps, instead of the outcome of any real ability or wit. I completed my food quietly while they proceeded with their talk, behaving as if nothing occurred. Dad inquired about my recent venture, and I provided him the essentials regarding a fresh business site I was building. Mom added questions about the schedule and funds, abruptly curious about the specifics of my allegedly lesser job when it impacted their easy living. Following sweets, I assisted in tidying the table and chatted lightly about plans for the days off. Mom noted desiring to update the visitor restroom, and Dad mentioned some repair problems with the swimming gear. I agreed, noting mentally about expenses and workers just as I typically did. They anticipated me to manage it all, but evidently my capability was merely a fortunate coincidence of inheritance rather than smarts. I traveled home that evening pondering every concession I'd made for their ease. The trips I'd foregone to pay their costs. The company chances I'd declined because they required instant monetary aid. The partnerships I'd neglected because kin duties always took priority. I'd constructed my whole grown-up existence around guaranteeing they never fretted about funds again. And my compensation was being labeled the foolish one before the kin. Back at my residence, I sat in my personal workspace looking at the computer display. The regular automated shifts were all displayed in my money handling program: loan payment, coverage, services, vehicle financing, charge cards, even a substantial regular stipend I'd arranged so they wouldn't need to request pocket money. Thousands of dollars exiting my balances each month to sustain their way of life, all because I'd aimed to look after the folks who nurtured me. I began with the minor items. The membership plans I'd been funding, their video streaming profiles, Mom's food shipping plan, Dad's golf association fee. A few taps and they were all terminated, starting right away. Then I proceeded to the charge cards. I'd been managing their regular payments for 2 years now. Since Mom's expenditures had escalated once more, I contacted the firms and withdrew myself as a permitted payer, informing them the profile owners would manage their own invoices from now on. The vehicle financing followed. Both cars were registered to them, but the regular payments withdrew from my balance automatically. I revoked the permissions and dispatched messages to both explaining they'd have to manage their own transport costs beginning next month. I was formal about it, nearly detached in my wording, stating that I was reorganizing my monetary pledges and could no longer offer help with their car costs. The services required more effort. Most were under my name since I'd arranged them all when they relocated, so I had to shift the profiles back to them. I phoned each firm and clarified that the profile owner was switching, and that I'd pay the last month to allow them time to arrange automatic deductions from their own balances. The power firm was especially quick about it, verifying that the new profile owner would get the initial invoice in 30 days. The residence was the largest choice. The loan was under my name, but the title included all 3 of us as proprietors. I'd set it up that way to dodge donation tax problems when I acquired the spot, never picturing I'd need to undo the setup. I dispatched a message to my lawyer inquiring about ways to shift complete ownership, clarifying that I wanted to detach myself from all monetary duties tied to the asset. By midnight, I'd methodically detached myself from every ongoing monetary duty to my kin. The regular shifts that had become as instinctive as respiration were all revoked. The charge cards, the coverage plans, the upkeep deals, everything was being shifted back to their duty. I figured the sum and saw I'd been expending nearly $4,000 a month on their way of life, not including the bigger costs like residence fixes or health invoices that arose occasionally. I composed a message detailing the alterations, aiming to balance between formal and intimate. I informed them I'd chosen to reorganize my monetary focuses and would no longer be capable of supplying the regular aid they'd become used to. I clarified that all profiles and plans would be shifted to their names over the next 30 days, and that I'd pay one last month of costs to give them time to modify their spending plans accordingly. The message remained in my pending folder for an hour while I doubted myself. These were my parents, the individuals who'd nurtured me and backed me through youth. Did one careless remark truly warrant ending all monetary aid? But then I recalled my siblings' chuckle of consent, Dad's deliberate dodging of gaze, and Mom's offhand harshness in rejecting all I'd achieved as the fortunate stumbling of someone too dim to earn a diploma. I pressed send at 1:17 a.m. My phone began buzzing at 6:45 the following morning. I allowed it to reach voicemail, then heard Mom's growing anxious recordings during the day. She'd attempted to request food via her shipping plan and found the profile was shut. Dad had received an alert from his golf association about unpaid fees. Their charge card was rejected at midday meal, and they'd learned I was no longer paying the bills. The recordings changed from puzzled to furious to hopeless throughout the day. Mom desired to know what sort of system error had led to all their plans being terminated at once. Dad left a blunt recording asking if I was facing some monetary trouble that I required assistance with. By night, the recordings had become blaming, with Mom insisting to know why I was penalizing them over some trivial remark at supper. I didn't respond to any of the calls. Update 1. 3 days later, my sibling appeared at my workplace. She'd come over on her midday break, still displaying her promotion specialist tag on a strap. She wanted to know what scheme I was executing, and when I intended to cease behaving like a kid over some innocent kin ribbing. I clarified to her that the ribbing had persisted for 13 years since I'd left university, that every kin meeting featured some mention of my absence of schooling, despite the reality that my allegedly lesser smarts had been financing their easy way of life for years. She attempted to claim that Mom hadn't intended anything grave by her remark, that it was merely her method of voicing regret over my schooling decisions. She inquired what I anticipated them to do now, and I proposed they could attempt existing within their true resources rather than the expanded way of life my inputs had enabled. She noted that they were both in their 60s, that Dad's spine issues made manual labor tough, and that Mom had never built job abilities because she'd been a homemaker for most of their union. I heard her points and recognized that the circumstances would be challenging for them. Then I inquired why she hadn't been adding to their aid despite being so worried about their well-being now. She clarified that her pay scarcely paid her own costs, and that she'd presumed I was content to assist since I earned far more. The discussion continued nearly an hour, with her switching between fury and begging. She blamed me of being spiteful and mean, then moved to inquiring what it would require for me to rethink. I informed her the monetary aid had concluded for good, but that I wasn't severing emotional ties. They were free to come over to phone to keep kin bonds that didn't include my finances. She departed upset, grumbling about how achievement had transformed me into someone she didn't know. Update 2. 2 weeks later, the actual outcomes began emerging. Mom phoned to inform me they were forfeiting the residence. Without my loan payments, they couldn't meet the monthly duty, and they'd already skipped one installment. The lender had dispatched a warning about the overdue amount, and they were confronting repossession actions if they couldn't recover swiftly. She'd secured employment working half-time at a retail outlet, but the earnings wouldn't approach covering their costs. Dad was seeking roles, but his years and wellness problems were complicating the hunt. They'd already ended their television plan and were discussing vending one of their vehicles to lower costs. The discussion differed from her prior upset recordings. There was a beaten tone to her speech that I'd never encountered before, and she confessed that they'd become overly relaxed with my monetary backing. She said she comprehended why I was upset, but inquired if I could at minimum assist them prevent losing the residence while they devised a lasting fix. I informed her I'd grant them 60 days to locate other lodging, and that I'd handle the loan payments in that span to avert repossession. After that, they'd need to either assume the payments or relocate somewhere they could pay for. The residence was valued sufficiently that they could vend it and acquire something tinier without debt if they chose wisely. She expressed gratitude for the 60-day delay, but inquired why I couldn't simply revert to how things were previously. I recalled her about the remark at supper, and she ultimately expressed regret for what she'd stated. She asserted she'd been attempting to encourage me to return to studies, not to wound my emotions or reject my successes. I welcomed her regret, but clarified that the monetary setup was concluding anyway. I'd recognized that my liberality had fostered a reliance that wasn't beneficial for any of us, and that it was time for them to assume accountability for their own existences again. Update 3. 6 months later, they'd relocated to a compact apartment building nearby. The lease was feasible on their joint half-time earnings, and they'd vended most of their unneeded items to streamline their way of life. Dad secured employment performing minor upkeep at a nearby commercial area, and Mom expanded her shifts at the retail outlet. Our bonds slowly reverted to something like ordinary, though meals were rarer and always at eateries where each covered their share. The offhand harshness had vanished from Mom's remarks, substituted by a more deferential recognition of my professional triumphs. She'd even begun seeking company guidance sometimes, truly keen on grasping how I'd developed my firms. My sibling required more time to accept, but ultimately confessed that the compelled self-reliance had likely been essential. She'd begun adding a modest sum each month to aid with their costs, finally assuming some duty for their well-being rather than anticipating me to manage it all solo. The most unexpected shift was in Dad. Without the monetary pressure and embarrassment of relying on his son's generosity, he'd become more involved and lively. The half-time employment was bodily feasible, and he appeared to feel pride in adding to their home again. He'd launched a minor carpentry pastime that generated sporadic additional earnings, and his general disposition had enhanced greatly. I retained the residence for several months before vending it to a youthful kin with 2 children. The gain went into my savings funds I likely should have been reserving all along rather than funding my kin's way of life. I discovered the difficult way that liberality without limits breeds bitterness on both ends, and that occasionally the most compassionate act you can perform for folks is compel them to support themselves. Reflecting, I believe Mom's remark at supper was the spark I'd required to identify an unviable setup. My monetary backing had begun as a short-term crisis step and slowly turned into a lasting support that hindered them from adjusting to their altered situations. The sudden halt was severe, but it compelled all of us to face truths we'd been evading for years. The credential matter never truly got settled, but it became unimportant. Achievement carries its own validity, and observing me construct several enterprises while they fought to handle fundamental costs rendered the schooling argument appear minor and meaningless. I demonstrated my wit through outcomes rather than qualifications, and even Mom had to recognize that my lever status hadn't stopped me from becoming the most economically steady individual in the kin. The ordeal instructed me important insights about limits, self-esteem, and the distinction between aiding and facilitating. I still assist kin members when they encounter real crises, but the automatic regular subsidies are ended eternally. They know I value them, but they also know that valuing doesn't signify funding everything anymore. Nowadays, when we share meals, everyone adds to the discussion as peers rather than donor and recipients. It's a more beneficial interaction, even if it demanded some tough changes to reach there. Sometimes the most affectionate act you can perform is decline to save folks from results they need to undergo.